She thought the ring on her hand meant forever. But in the end, Nora Whitlow sold it for a loaf of bread. That was the part most folks in Willow Bend never knew, that behind the whispers, behind the gray hair and quiet eyes of the widow on the edge of town, was a woman who had carried more hunger and heartbreak than anyone cared to imagine. One evening, she laid her wedding ring thin with years dulled by a loveless past on the counter of the general store and walked out with a sack of flour and a single loaf. To some it looked like desperation. To Nora it was survival. But what came next no one could have predicted, because across the valley lived Eli McCrae, a rancher nearly her age who had known his own kind of loneliness. And when he heard of the widow who had traded away her last token of love, something stirred in him. Not pity, not charity, but recognition, the kind that only another soul marked by loss could understand. And then one day, without warning, the ring returned to Nora. But it was no longer the same. Inside the band, etched with careful hands, was a new name, his. What was missed in the telling was the years of silence she had endured, the cruel words of neighbors, the brother-in-law who sought to shame her, the nights she feared hope was too late for her. Yet here was a man who didn't see her as ruined or used up, but as someone strong enough to have survived. This is where the story truly begins. A widow who had nothing left to give but kindness, a rancher who had lost more than he could bear, in a single gold band that carried them both into a love no one thought possible. The emotional spark, a woman forced to trade away her past just to eat. The tragedy, a lifetime of being dismissed, whispered about, left behind. The curiosity that follows. What will happen when the ring returns? Change inscribed, carrying not just a man's name, but a chance at hope. Because sometimes what you let go of doesn't vanish. Sometimes it circles back, carrying a future you never dreamed was yours to claim. So stay with us as we step into the windswept prairies of the West, where silence can last decades, until one quiet act turns it into a song. Will Nora choose to wear that ring again? Not as a memory, but as a promise. Will Eli's steady hand be enough to silence the voices of her past? And can love found so late truly heal what the years had broken? This is the widow who sold her wedding ring for bread, and the rancher who returned it with his name inside. The summer heat lay over Willow Bend like a heavy quilt, the kind that pressed the breath from your chest. Dust clung to every window, every fence post, every memory. Nora Whitlow, 51 years old, stood at the counter of the town's general store with her hands folded neatly in front of her. In her palm lay a small worn circle of gold, a wedding ring. It had been forced onto her finger decades ago by a man she had never loved, then carried through years of silence, insults, and nights when the house felt colder than the prairie wind. Today that ring had been reduced to something simpler, almost cruelly practical, the cost of a loaf of bread. How much? Nora asked quietly. The storekeeper lifted the ring, squinting. Not worth much. Gold's thin. Nora only nodded. She didn't argue. She never argued anymore. Arguments belonged to another lifetime, back when she still believed her voice could change anything. She signed the ledger with careful strokes, received the bread, a small sack of flour, and some salt. Things to keep a body alive another day. Walking home, she broke off a piece of the bread, tucking half into her apron for the morning. She chewed slowly, tasting salt. She wasn't sure it came from the crust or from her own tears. By the time she reached her cabin on the edge of town, the sun was sinking, and her shadow stretched long and thin against the walls like a ghost that had been waiting for her all these years. That night she lit a single oil lamp. Its light made her appear taller, sterner, but inside she felt like a stalk of wheat left standing after harvest, still upright, though brittle. She sat with the silence, remembering the ring she'd given away. Not as a treasure, not even as a keepsake, but as food. Across the valley at his ranch, Eli McCrae, nearing 60, was closing up the barn. He had heard whispers of a widow who sold her ring for bread. Something about that story touched him more sharply than he expected, like a nail driven into old timber. He knew what it was to lose, to bury a wife, to carry loneliness like a saddle no one else could lift. Two lives, two silences stretched across the same valley. Neither knew the other would soon enter the empty rooms of their hearts. Sometimes the things we give up return in ways we never imagined. Could a ring sold for bread one day circle back as a promise of hope? The following Sunday, the church bell tolled across Willow Bend, its sound carrying over dust and prairie grass. Most folks came not only for worship, but for company voices, handshakes, the sight of faces that proved you weren't alone in the wide stretch of land. Nora Whitlow sat near the back as she always did. Her dress was plain, her hair neatly braided, her hands folded in her lap. She had learned to sit still, to disappear into the background of other people's lives. Yet she still came, because even loneliness needs the comfort of being near others. That morning the preacher's words slipped past her like water, but her eyes caught on something else. A man entered, late, tall shoulders squared by years of work. His beard had turned silver, his skin carved by sun and time. Eli McCrae. He hadn't been to church in months, some said years. The loss of his wife had carved him hollow, left him buried in chores and cattle. But here he was, lowering himself carefully onto the pew across the aisle, just far enough not to draw attention. Their eyes met only once, briefly, but it was enough. In that glance, Nora saw not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. As if he had looked at her and seen not the widow who sold her ring for bread, but a soul as weathered as his own. After the service, when folks milled about, Nora slipped out quietly. The sun was bright, unforgiving. She carried her empty basket. Once it had held bread. Today it held only air. But halfway down the church steps, a shadow stretched beside her. A voice low and steady followed. Mrs. Whitlow. She turned. Eli held his hat in his hands, his eyes gentle, though his frame was broad and unyielding. I heard about the ring. He said, his words careful, respectful. That must have been a hard day. Nora's throat tightened. Shame flushed her face. She wanted to explain to make it sound less pitiful, but Eli did not press. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch. From it, he showed her something glinting. Her breath caught. It was her ring. I bought it back from the storekeeper, Eli said. Not to shame you, not to give charity, but because I think some things deserve to come home. Nora's fingers trembled. She did not reach for it. Instead, she whispered, and what if home no longer exists? Eli's eyes softened. Then maybe it's time to make a new one. The words lingered, hovering like the bell's echo, long after the sound had gone. That night, Nora sat in her cabin with the ring resting on the table before her. She did not put it on, not yet, but for the first time in many years, she didn't feel entirely forgotten. Could a man's quiet gesture truly return not only a ring, but the hope she had buried with it? For several nights, Nora Whitlow left the ring untouched on her table. It caught the lamplight like a quiet accusation, as if asking her to decide who she was, the woman who had given it away for bread, or the woman who might still be worthy of love. Each evening, she found herself pacing the small cabin, her fingers brushing against its wooden walls. These walls had heard her prayers when her husband's fists silenced her voice. They had witnessed her tears when neighbors whispered that she was unlucky or hard to love. The ring was not only a circle of gold, it was a circle of memory, of promises made and broken, of dignity lost and reclaimed. Why would Eli McCrae return it? She asked herself this over and over. In the store, in her garden at night when the coyotes cried. He had said it was not charity. But hadn't she lived long enough to know that charity, pity, and shame often came dressed in gentle tones? And yet when she remembered his eyes steady, weathered, almost sorrowful, her heart shifted. This was a man who had known grief. She could see it in the way his shoulders drooped when no one was looking in, how he held his hat like it weighed more than iron. Still the fear remained. To let him close was to risk losing again, and Nora had spent a lifetime losing. One afternoon, while gathering water from the well, she heard footsteps on the path. Turning, she found Eli standing there, hat in hand again. I wanted to return this to you properly, he said, holding out the ring. Nora folded her arms, her voice firmer than she felt. Why does it matter to you what I sold Mr. McCrae? The ring was mine to give away. It matters, Eli answered quietly, because I know what it's like to part with something you never thought you'd lose. My wife's shawl still hangs by the door. Sometimes I think I should give it away, but I can't. Not yet. Nora's breath caught. His honesty cut through her defenses, sharper than any judgment. You think a ring can make me whole again? She whispered. No, Eli said simply. But I think maybe you deserve to decide what it means to you, instead of hunger deciding for you. His words sank deep. That night alone again, Nora slid the ring onto her finger, not as a memory of her first marriage, not as a chain to sorrow, but as a reminder that she had survived, that she still had choices, still her heart warred against itself. Could she let Eli's kindness into her life, or would it unravel the fragile shield she had built around her soul? Sometimes the hardest battles are not against others, but against the fear of being seen again. Was Nora ready to be seen? The autumn winds swept over Willowben, carrying with them the smell of dry grass and wood smoke. Days grew shorter, nights colder. For Nora Whitlow, evenings once meant silence so thick she could hear her own heartbeat. But lately silence was no longer so heavy, because Eli McCrae had begun to appear. It started with small gestures, a sack of potatoes left by her door, a fence mended where it had sagged for years. One afternoon when her firewood pile was low, she found it stacked neatly twice as high without a word spoken. At first she wanted to protest, to insist she didn't need a man's help. Pride had been her last armor, and she wore it like a shield. But slowly she saw that Eli's kindness was not charity. He never lingered for thanks. He didn't boast or seek notice. His actions spoke of something quieter: respect. One chilly evening, he knocked on her door. "I'm heading out to drive cattle at dawn," he said. "Thought you might like some meat for the winter." She opened her mouth to refuse, then stopped. The truth pressed against her lips. She had been stretching beans and cornbread too thin. Hunger was a shadow she still lived with. "Thank you," she whispered instead. He nodded, his expression softening. "You remind me of the cottonwoods near my creek. They bend in the wind, but they're always still standing when the storms pass." The words lingered long after he left. For the first time in years, Nora felt seen, not for her scars, not for her widowhood or shame, but for her strength. Winter arrived harshly. Snow lay thick across the valley, creaking under wagon wheels, muffling footsteps. Nora's cabin was drafty, her roof patched with tar and old shingles. Yet somehow she didn't dread the nights as before, because often Eli stopped by. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he shared a meal. Once he even carried in a fiddle, playing tunes so soft and steady that Nora felt as though the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. She in turn found herself baking more biscuits, pies when she had apples, small loaves of bread that warmed her cabin. She had once thought she had nothing left to give, but sharing those meals with Eli reminded her that giving didn't always mean losing. Sometimes it meant healing. One evening when the snow pressed against the cabin windows, like white curtains, Eli stayed longer than usual. The fire popped in the hearth shadows, dancing across their faces. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the ring again. But this time she noticed something new. Inside the band, etched in careful strokes, was a name. His name. Eli McCrae. Her breath caught. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. He looked at her steadily. "Because I don't see this ring as a memory of your past anymore. I see it as a promise that you're not meant to walk the rest of your years alone. And if you'll have me, I'd like to walk them with you." Nora's throat tightened. Her mind flooded with voices from the past, her late husband's cruelty, the town's whispers, her own doubts, that she was too old, too worn, too much to be chosen. "I'm not young anymore," she said quietly, almost apologetically. "My hands ache. My body's heavier. I can't give you children or a fresh start." Eli leaned forward, his voice steady as the snow outside. "Nora, I'm not looking for what's gone. I'm looking for what remains. And what remains in you is kindness and strength and a heart I respect more than anything." Her tears came then, not sharp but slow and warm, like snow melting under spring sun. For years she had held them back, locked tight in the cage of survival. Now they fell freely, and Eli didn't look away. He let her cry, sitting close, without pressing, without rescuing, without pity. Only presence. When her sobs eased, she whispered, "I don't know if I can love again." "Then let's not rush," Eli said softly. "Let's start with trust. The rest can come as slow as it needs." For the first time in decades, Nora felt something shift inside her. The chains she had carried, the shame, the loneliness, the fear of being seen, began to loosen. It was not freedom all at once, but it was the beginning of release. That night when Eli left, she touched the ring once more. She did not put it on yet, but she held it to her chest and whispered a prayer, not of desperation, but of gratitude. In the weeks that followed, townsfolk noticed small changes. Nora's steps were lighter at church. Eli's eyes, once shadowed, seemed to hold a quiet brightness again. Whispers began, as they always did in small places. Could those two be keeping company? Some gossiped with amusement, some with scorn. But Nora found that she no longer cared as much. The valley winds still howled, but inside her chest, something warm had been lit. On a clear February morning, Nora opened her door to find Eli waiting, two horses saddled behind him. "Ride with me," he said simply. They rode past snow-covered fields through cottonwoods that stood like white sentinels. Finally, they reached a ridge where the land opened wide, the sky stretching endless and blue. Eli turned to her. "This is where I come when I feel close to God, and I wanted you to see it, because I don't think I'm meant to stand here alone anymore." Nora closed her eyes, breathing in the cold air. She thought of the girl she once was, the girl forced into a marriage silenced by cruelty, mocked by neighbors. She thought of the widow who had sold her ring for bread. And then she thought of the woman she was now, scarred, yes, but still standing, still choosing, still capable of warmth. For the first time, she let herself smile. Maybe, she whispered, this is where we both begin again. That night back at her cabin, Nora slid the ring onto her finger. Not as a symbol of the past, but as a promise of the future. And for the first time in decades, it felt like home. When walls of fear crumble, the heart remembers how to breathe. But can the valley accept a love born so late, so unexpected? The thaw came slowly that spring. Snow melted in silver ribbons along the creek beds, and the earth softened enough for plows to turn it once more. With the changing season, a different kind of stirring took root in Nora Whitlow's heart. She had worn the ring now for weeks, not hidden, not explained away. At church, when she clasped her hands in prayer, the etched name inside pressed against her skin. It no longer reminded her of shame. It reminded her of choice. And yet small towns have long memories and sharper tongues. Whispers rustled through Willow Bend like dry grass in the wind. A widow and a rancher. At their age, she sold her first husband's ring, and now she wears another man's name inside it. She's no young bride. What could she possibly offer him? Nora heard the words, though no one spoke them to her face. She carried them home like stones in her pockets. But Eli stood firm. When they walked together after Sunday service, he didn't glance away from the stairs. His hand brushed against hers, steady, deliberate, as though saying, "Let them talk." Still, the doubts crept in at night. She would sit by her fire staring at her worn hands, remembering the weight of loneliness. Was she foolish to believe in love so late, to believe it could still bloom after decades of silence? One evening, Eli arrived with a bundle of wildflowers, scraggly, windblown, but bright as spilled sunlight. "Not much of a bouquet," he admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "But I saw them pushing through the thaw and thought of you, strong enough to rise again." Her throat tightened. No one had ever brought her flowers before. "Eli," she said softly, "do you ever wonder what people think every day?" he answered. "But I've learned something. People's tongues don't keep a man warm at night, or make the morning coffee sweeter, or laugh at his poor fiddle playing. You do." For the first time, laughter rose from her, not cautious, not small, but full and free. It startled even her, that sound she hadn't heard in years. Hope settled deeper into her bones that evening. Not the fragile hope of a girl waiting for rescue, but the steady hope of a woman who had survived storms and was now willing to plant seeds in thawing soil. As the weeks passed, their companionship grew. They rode horses along the valley. They mended fences side by side. Some evenings, Eli read aloud by lamplight while Nora quilted. They were simple things, yet they filled the hollow spaces of both their lives. And with each passing day, Nora began to see herself differently, not as the widow who had been discarded, but as a woman chosen, seen, cherished. The world had told her she was too old, too plain, too worn. But here was a man who saw her strength as beauty, her survival as grace. One afternoon, she found herself watching him repair her porch rail. His hair caught the sun, silver against the sky. She felt the unfamiliar ache of gratitude swelling within her chest. "Eli," she whispered, more to herself than him. "Maybe the years didn't take everything. Maybe they saved the best for last." He looked up as though he had heard her, And in his smile she saw not pity or longing for what had been lost, but simple, steadfast joy. For the first time in decades, Nora believed that love was not behind her. It was here now, unfolding like the prairie after winter, slow, surprising, but unstoppable. Hope is a tender thing, easily bruised but fierce in its return. Could it survive when shadows of the past and voices of the town rose against it once more? Spring was never without storms. The prairie knew it, the cattle knew it, and so did Nora Whitlow. After a season of small peace, the winds shifted. It began at the mercantile. Nora stepped inside one April morning, basket in hand, only to feel the sudden hush. A pair of women whispered near the bolts of fabric, their eyes darting her way. One muttered just loud enough, imagine. Selling her husband's ring like it was scrap and now wearing another man's name. Another added, no children, no kin. She'll only weigh him down. Nora stiffened, her cheeks burning. For years she had carried insults like these, but something in her heart had changed. They no longer slid off her like rain. They pressed deeper because now she had something precious to lose. Later that day, Eli found her mending clothes by the fire, her stitches uneven. They said things again, didn't they? He asked quietly. She didn't answer, only set down the needle. Maybe they're right, Eli. Maybe I'm just a burden. You could choose someone younger, someone. He cut her off, his voice firm, but kind. I've had younger. I've had what the world calls ideal, and it left me widowed and hollow. What I want now is someone who understands the weight of silence. Someone who knows loss and still chooses kindness. That's you, Nora. Only you. Her eyes filled, but the doubt lingered. The confrontation didn't come only from gossip. One evening, a figure from Nora's past appeared. Her late husband's brother, Samuel Whitlow, rode into town. A man with the same cold eyes, the same sharp jawline. He sought her out, standing tall in her yard. I hear you're keeping company with McCrae, he said, voice heavy with disdain. My brother's name may be gone, but it don't change what you are. Folks don't forget. Nora's knees trembled, but Eli stepped forward. She owes you nothing, Samuel, he said, steady as a rock. Samuel sneered. You think you can erase history with a new ring? She'll bring you nothing but shame. The old fear returned. Samuel's tone carried the same venom her husband once had. For a moment she was that younger wife again, silenced and trapped. But then Eli's hand brushed hers, grounding her. His presence was a wall not of domination, but of defense. This land has seen enough cruelty, Eli said evenly. If you've come to spit venom, you can turn your horse around. Nora has earned her peace. Samuel's eyes narrowed, but seeing Eli's unflinching stance, he spat in the dirt and left. That night, Nora trembled by the fire. Eli, she whispered, what if they're right? What if I'm cursed to always be seen through their eyes? He knelt beside her, his weathered hand closing over hers. Then let them look all they want. The truth is, I don't see you through their eyes. I see you through mine. And what I see is the bravest woman I've ever known. The words struck deep like water into dry ground. Yet fear and hope wrestled inside her still. Days later in church, whispers rose again. But this time, Nora did something she hadn't in decades. She lifted her chin and held Eli's hand openly in front of everyone. Gasps echoed, but she didn't let go. The prairie sun slanted through the chapel windows, and for the first time she felt the chains of shame break, not because the town had changed, but because she had. Sometimes the fiercest battles aren't with enemies outside, but with the voices we've carried within for years. Could Nora truly silence them long enough to embrace the love before her? The prairie turned green again. Wildflowers pushing up through the thawed earth, their fragile petals braving the wind. To many in Willow Bend, it was an ordinary spring. But to Nora Whitlow, it was the first season of her life that felt like a beginning, not an ending. She had chosen at last to wear the ring without shame. Each morning when she washed her hands, she turned the band and traced the name carved inside Eli McCrae. It no longer felt like borrowed belonging or a desperate trade for bread. It felt like a promise that she herself had claimed. The church bells rang one warm Sunday, calling the valley together. Nora had dreaded gatherings her whole life. She had always been the subject of whispers, the woman avoided, judged or pitied. But this time was different. Eli walked beside her, steady as the earth itself. When they entered the chapel, hands brushed, then clasped firm and unashamed. Murmurs rippled through the congregation, But Nora's gaze did not falter. For the first time, she let them look and found she no longer trembled. The sermon that morning spoke of renewal, of how even parched land can bloom again if given water. Nora sat in the wooden pew, her heart swelling with a truth she had once doubted her years had not been wasted. The scars, the loneliness, the ridicule, they had shaped her into someone who could finally understand love, not as fleeting fire, but as steady light. Later that week, Eli took her riding again to the ridge above the valley where the horizon opened wide. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. He dismounted and turned to her. "Nora," he said softly, "I've waited a long time to ask this, but I don't want to wait another day. Will you stand with me not as the town sees you, not as your past defined you, but as my partner, my equal, my heart's home?" Tears blurred her vision. She slid down from the saddle, her boots crunching the soft ground. For years she had been asked questions that stripped her of choice. Will you marry this man? Will you endure this silence? Will you accept this burden? But now, for the first time, the question was hers to answer freely. She reached for his hands. "Yes, Eli, I will." The wind swept over them, carrying the words across the valley. For Nora, it felt like chains breaking, like years of silence dissolving into air. That evening, as they returned to her cabin, she baked bread, warm, fragrant, gold-encrusted. It was the same act that had first drawn her into Eli's life when she had carried a loaf to a man lost in grief. Now it was not an offering of survival, but a celebration of love found late yet true. They sat together by the fire, sharing the bread, laughter soft between them. No grand declarations, no loud promises, just the quiet, steady joy of two souls who had weathered storms and chosen each other anyway. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and wild. Inside, Nora knew something she had not dared to believe. For 50 years, love had not passed her by. It had simply waited patient, as the land itself, until she was ready to receive it. When love comes late, it carries not just sweetness, but the healing of all the years before. And sometimes that makes it the truest gift of all. In the end, Nora Whitlow discovered something she had long stopped believing, in that love can return even when we think it has passed us by. What began with a desperate trade for bread became a story of dignity, redemption, and a ring that carried not shame, but hope. For all of us, there are chapters in life where we feel forgotten, where our sacrifices go unseen, and where whispers of the past try to define who we are. But Nora's journey reminds us the past may shape us, yet it does not have to be the final word. Healing can come quietly, like a spring breeze on the prairie. Love can arrive late and still be full, steady, and true. Perhaps that is something we can carry into our own days, that even in seasons of loss, we are still worthy of tenderness, still capable of beginning again. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us here at None Wild West Saga, where we share tales that remind us of resilience, kindness, and love that endures. Please subscribe, share, and let us know in the comments. Would you like to hear more stories like this one of widows, ranchers, and second chances under the wide western sky? Or perhaps is there a story from your own life that deserves to be told, because every voice matters? And sometimes sharing it is the first step toward healing.